So I'm going to be talking about parliamentary storytelling as a means of engaging more in Parliament. So I'm going to be using the UK Parliament as a case in point, but a lot of the themes raised here are pretty universal across different parliaments. Okay, fantastic. So this is very much a piece of ongoing research for me, so I'd be appreciative of any sort of questions or comments after this is done. I'll try as best I can to stick to a concise 10 minutes. But I'm going to be talking about storytelling and narrative a bit more broadly as an element of engaging and connecting with the work of Parliament and increasing citizen interest and participation. So narrative is quite a new area of research as far as parliaments go. Obviously, it's well covered ground in its own respect, but in terms of bringing it to the study of parliaments, it's still kind of a nebulous area of inquiry. What I've done in the theoretical framework that I came up with is split this process of parliamentary storytelling, that is to say, parliaments using storytelling and narrative techniques to build stronger relationships with their citizens. I have split this into 5 components, really. So the storyteller, the narrative, the characters, the plot, and the audience. I'll be going through all of them in detail with a couple of examples for each. One particular example I'm going to be looking at. So in this case, it's the House of Commons Petitions Committee. It was set up fairly recently in July 2015 in order to consider petitions and later on e-petitions that were submitted to the House of Commons. So it kind of plays an oversight role, but also a direct participation role in that respect. And we're going to be talking about, in particular, an e-petition that was asking government to fund more research into brain tumours. The committee itself was concerned with 2 things, really. The fact that there hadn't been much discussion, certainly not recently, on brain tumours, and also concern about a government response about this topic, suggested that the government hadn't really grasped the seriousness of the issue, so they decided to launch an inquiry and to essentially tell a story about the experience of that inquiry. So a very unusual kind of inquiry in that respect, which has all kinds of knock-on effects for the kind of language that was used. This is just a sort of front cover for the report itself. It's easily findable if you Google it. So just to take the first component of this idea of parliamentary storytelling, the storyteller, who is actually telling the story, who does the story belong to? So it doesn't, in a very real sense, belong to Parliament. It belongs to the people who actually presided over the production of that report. So in this case, it would be the staff members at the heart of the administrative side of the Petitions Committee. So I've named them here kind of as storytellers, the people who are actually putting across this tale, this experience. And what are the intentions of the storyteller? Well, in one sense, they sort of control the organization of the bits of information in order to have some sense of influence over what that might mean in practice and how people might understand and digest that information. They do enjoy a fantastic amount of privilege in that sense because they control the story. This goes all the way back to traditional narrative theory of the storyteller as the person who controls how the story is going to turn out, not necessarily what it means. It's up to the audience to decide that, but they obviously have a lot of agency over what they actually put across. And we, as members of the audience, as participants, we experience the story through the eyes of people who are a bit different to storytellers, through the narrators. And the narrators in this case are the people whose experiences actually compose the material in this report. So people like Maria Lester, people like Peter Ralph, people who had actually lost loved ones, friends, family to brain tumours and had obviously a vested interest in trying to engineer change and to get Parliament and government to pay attention to release more funding for brain tumour research. And the parliamentary committee that I'm talking about, the Petitions Committee, was very upfront in presenting this as a kind of story of those who were affected, those who tragically lost their lives, and those who experienced, the loss of a close relative or friend. So they were very explicit in presenting the story in their own words. So not the words of the committee, not the words of Parliament, but the words of those affected, which again is quite a new thing for any Parliament, but in this case, certainly for the UK Parliament. And experiencing through it, through the eyes of the narrators is an interesting thing. So with a true story like this, rather than a fictional story, there's an inbuilt impact there because we know what's happening is true. But at the same time, there's still a kind of persona that the storytellers have. There's still some kind of influence that the people who communicate the story will have. So hence the, I think, rather beautiful quote from Walter Benjamin about the idea that the story kind of clings to its storyteller, the person who actually makes the story available. There's some kind of imprint, some identity, some influence there. And it's really crucial to understanding engagement more broadly, the sort of political process of participation and connection. It raises the question of, what is there to connect to? Who is there to connect to? And a lot of the time, what we connect to is the people who, whose eyes we experience the story through, those who experience it. So we experience it through the narrators, who are actually sort of participating in some sense, who observe what's going on, as I mentioned earlier, the people who lost loved ones, but also characters who participate, and that's perhaps a bit more of a broader group that we'll mention in just a second. And obviously there is an overlap between the two. So often characters in a story do relate through sort of first-person narration, and sometimes they're also the storyteller. So going into characters, the sort of participants in the story, rather than those whose eyes we see it through. It was interesting to see some subsequent discussion about this inquiry within Parliament at a plenary level. So the Petitions Committee chair, for example, sort of spoke about stories in an explicit way, the idea that they are there for a reason. And I think the implication here is that the reason is that these stories are affecting, these stories are important to capture unadulterated. It isn't just the word of Parliament, it isn't just the opinion of the committee. There's a responsibility here at the legislative level to sort of to translate and put across and communicate personal experiences that are going to be relevant to all kinds of areas, all kinds of topics. Just to delve into this in a bit more kind of narrative theory, as I say, sort of this idea of characters is very much bound up with sort of participation in the story itself. They play a really crucial role in kind of humanizing the story, humanizing the topic, even those who are sort of later talking about these stories are participants. So Helen Jones, for example, could be thought of as a character because she was transmitting so much of the importance of this. She was kind of raising the profile of these stories, and in doing so, I think sort of helping citizens to engage with some of the work of Parliament, but also helping parliamentarians to better understand their constituents, which is obviously a really crucial aspect of engagement, because MPs want to hear from them. So it's not just that they have to be sort of part of the story. It's enough for them to be, and it's desirable for them to be sort of observers of it and an audience in some sense. There's also an element of plot here. So as I mentioned earlier, it's about this kind of organizing principle of the events. So here, a report that's written in a kind of narrative storytelling style about brain tumor research. What's the plot here? What ties it together? It's a brain tumor research. It's a journey that the petition goes on. Is it the importance of a petition select committee or a parliamentary select committee more broadly? In a sense, it's all of these. It's very much the current that's running through a report like this. It's very much implicit that this is one of the reasons why Parliament matters and why a committee matters. But it's also very explicit in putting across the experiences of others, sort of outside the sphere of Westminster. And this is an important element of any storytelling practice, any narrative practice, because it helps us to find our way through a story and to figure out in our own subjective sense what this story is really about. So what's the sequence of events? What does it mean to me as a person in the audience? We'll be talking about that in just a second. But as I say, the storyteller kind of controls what actually is part of the plot. So the sequence of events goes some way to shaping the organizing principles here, so what it's kind of about. But it's left to the audience to decide what that means, and by extension, what that means to them, because again, all of this is a subjective, dynamic process. Any of us as readers would understand and agree with that, I'm sure. So just to come to the last component of that, the importance of the audience, and this very much has repercussions for engagement more broadly. Engagement is not just communication out to a bunch of people, to a particular audience. It's a dynamic with them, it's a relationship, it's a dialogue. All of this is sort of two-way and multi-dimensional rather than something that's basically broadcasting. You know, engagement is not the same as broadcasting. It's in a sense an antithesis. If broadcasting is what we want, that's a very different. That's a very different topic. That's a very different process, and different objectives belong to that. So the audience here, I've very broadly categorized into, consistent with narrative theory, people who are specifically addressed. So addressed through terms like you and we, like that kind of thing. So in the brain tumor research report, it's the journey of your e-petition. That's when the term you is used. So it's interesting to see that as a message right at the beginning of the report. It tracks what has actually happened in terms of participation, which I think is really important for citizens' feelings of efficacy. When we sign a petition, I'm sure you'll agree, we'll want to know that there's some meaningful outcome. Efficacy is a really important part of engagement, obviously, but it's good to see, again, in a kind of narrative sense, what that has led to, and what kind of changes that has wrought, and how widely we throw the net in terms of the influence that can have. Something like a petition is sometimes quite difficult to tell what effect it has had, but it does contribute to a broader sense of dialogue and involvement and participation that can be really influential and very positive change. Though this often raises more questions than it answers in terms of who is in the audience and who is not in the audience. Parliaments, as with any political institution, have a lot of ground to recover in terms of excluded audiences, excluded communities. It's not just a case of the electorate and voting, it's a case of belonging, on wandering into a parliamentary building, who feels included and represented as part of that and who does not. And this goes back to this idea about audiences being a real part of this storytelling process and about the practice of engagement more broadly. And it puts the responsibility on Parliament to decide what kind of audience they want to speak to, how inclusive and restrictive they want to be there, because the initiative in question is going to create, or more accurately, presuppose a particular audience. Often it's just, you know, a case of directly addressing them. You know, who do we actually want to reach? Is that sufficient? Is that desirable? Is that enough? And again, this is very consistent with the idea of storytelling as a dynamic process. It's not just me telling you things, it's me engaging you in an ongoing dialogue of engagement. So I just want to make a couple of final points about the effect of this report and maybe what relevance it has more broadly. So the Petitions Committee, again, uncharacteristically explicit in terms of the effect that the stories and the process of writing about them had on them. This is a quote from within the report itself, talking about being deeply touched by people's willingness to share these stories, and again, kind of humanizing the committee, and maybe even by extension the institution of Parliament, which, as I'm sure you all agree, is a really important thing to try and strengthen and improve, especially in modern age. And we also see kind of a lot of inversions of, you know, kind of who's the narrator, who's the storyteller. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, stories can relate the institution of Parliament to citizens. It can help humanize them, but it can also help to relay and sort of make all the more significant citizen stories to parliamentarians and representatives. So here is what we might conceptualize as a really positive sort of feedback loop of engagement, sort of meaningful engagement based on what is taken to be important by all parties concerned. You know, issues that are important to the citizens and stories and input that are important to the work of Parliament and parliamentarians. And just to leave you with a couple of thoughts about the process of storytelling and how it really lends itself to engagement, because it does allow us to inhabit the minds and experiences of others that we have not directly experienced ourselves. The intentions of the storyteller in this respect, so parliamentary committees, other parliamentary departments and individuals, it's really vital because they present the story, they present the narrators, they present the characters, they present the plot, and they also represent the audience. audience to itself. They call into being a particular audience through the words they use, the way in which they present it. So again, this is relevant to engagement more broadly in terms of the kind of initiatives that we're using and the way that we're presenting them. Right off the bat, that's a particular audience that we are conceptualizing and sort of calling into being. And the sort of success or failure of an engagement campaign might be leaning upon that. And this term parliamentary storytelling is particularly important because so much of what we communicate to each other as important is already narrative in nature. If we are talking about something that's important, a lot of the time we couch that in narrative terms. We tell stories about ourselves. We are a storytelling species, if you like. So understanding how this works in practice and the different components of narrative as it pertains to communication and engagement is absolutely vital. So it's all the more important to better understand a process that's already underway in order to improve what is a growing area of parliamentary activity, that is to say, connecting to citizens, making citizens more interested in the parliamentary process, and making claims for the continued and growing importance of parliaments as institutions for politics, for democracy. Thank you very much. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.